Hey all! So, I gotta give you some warning. I'm gonna be away for a little while. The family's going to descend on the nation's capital to celebrate Canada's 150th. I won't get into how problematic that number 150 is, but regardless, Canada Day in Ottawa has always been fantastic. It is something to see. The outward expression of national pride on our otherwise stoic and apologetic Canadian faces. This week I thought I'd talk about my CanLit history. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm a tad older than the majority demographic here on BookTube, which is to say the last time I read almost all of these books was probably longer than most booktubers were even alive. And maybe that says something as to the fact that they're all written by male authors, predominantly white. Now, I've since tried to make a conscious effort to diversify my reading, but at the time, these were pivotal CanLit books for me. So, let's get started. So I have to start with Douglas Coupland's Generation X. It was a generation-defining, not to mention a generation-naming novel. Coupland has a knack for terms. He gave the world the McJob, but the pages are littered with other terms that, frankly, aren't still in use, which is an impossibility given the infinitesimally small half-life of words in today's internet age, where you see words rise, fall, and then return ironically in less than a year. I mean, shade and lit are still in use, but bay and on fleek are already falling into disuse. Now, Coupland doesn't have the same knack for brevity, but he still gives us terms whose logic still holds, even though they're a little awkward in execution. Things like ultra-short-term nostalgia, which is this nostalgia for the extremely recent past, which seems to still affect us now with Trump in power, where you can, reminisce about things not so bad a week ago or a month ago. Or click maintenance, which is the need for every generation to see the generation that follows as somehow deficient to bolster its collective ego. Think avocado toast and every millennial think piece that blames millennials for the death of everything from napkins to golf to breakfast cereal, the McWrap, as well as bar soap. I mean, clearly monsters. Or conspicuous minimalism, the non-ownership of material goods flaunted as a token of intellectual and moral superiority. Nowadays, we'd probably shorten that to something like condoism. And metaphasia, the inability to perceive metaphor. Nowadays, we simply call that Drax the Destroyer. Now, of course, there was tons more. It's been a quarter century since I last read the book, but I loved it so much I filled the pages with marginalia with my deepest, innermost, anguished thoughts, which is probably why I don't own the book anymore. I mean, it was so tied to my 20-something self to the point of cringiness, like a bad high school haircut or your first attempts at poetry. I had to throw it out along with my Varney sweatshirts and Ocean Pacific tees. I'd say today's most contemporary counterpart to that is Tony Tulowitzki's Private Citizens, which also blew me away, but in the 90s it was all Douglas Coupland. Speaking of gay Canadian authors, my next choice is Timothy Finley's Not Wanted on the Voyage. It's a retelling of the Noah myth, but not in the fun, irreverent way like Christopher Moore's Lamb. This is way darker and laden with metaphor. I mean, God's a dick. Noah's a tyrant. There's a talking cat, Lucifer in drag, and Noah's son marinated to a permanent blue. I mean, what's not to like? Well, there is an incident with Noah's 11-year-old daughter-in-law and a unicorn's horn, but that aside, this was my favorite on the Finley hit parade. I loved the wars. I really enjoyed Headhunter, but by the time The Piano Man's Daughter came around, I'd lost interest. But more importantly, Finley was my first author signing. He was out touring his book Headhunter, which I liked but should have liked way more than I did. I mean, it featured a crazed librarian who sets Kurtz from Heart of Darkness free into the streets of Toronto and features lots of other literary cameos. I guess it just simply couldn't live up to the expectations set by his earlier works. Anyway, Finley was a warm and engaging speaker and was enough of a big deal that he even had an opening act. Russell Smith was coattailing his debut novel How Insensitive at the time. He's since gone on to write for Culture and Style for the Globe and Mail here in Canada. Now, since then, I have attended tons and tons of author signings, and it's the same thing every time. By the time I get to the front of the line, I mumble something about, "I loved your book," before running away with my signed copy. I don't know what to say. I'm asking you, when you go to an author signing, what do you say when you get to the front of the line? Speaking of author signings, I'm working on my segues here. One of the last books I got signed was Sweetland by Michael Crummey, and that was sort of a big deal because this book sits in my all-time top 5. Sweetland is a small island off the coast of Newfoundland. It's been targeted for resettlement. The government has offered every island resident $100,000 if they leave the island, and so the government no longer has to run services to it. But there's a catch. It's an all or nothing deal. Everyone has to leave the island or no one gets paid. Moses Sweetland decides he is not going to leave the island, and clearly that has made the rest of the island natives unhappy. This is a book about isolation, death, and a lost way of life. The setting is cold, grim, unsettling, and totally Canadian. I don't know why this isn't part of the CanLit canon. I mean, I was steeped in Monroe, Atwood, Shields, Lawrence, and Leacock, but there's this huge blind spot when it comes to Crummy. I'm almost afraid to read his earlier work Galore, because how could it possibly live up to my expectations considering how great Sweetland was? Although I recently read A Sorrow of Love and Techno, which I'd been putting off forever. How could it ever follow up A Constellation of Vital Phenomena? It wasn't as good, but it was still fantastic. So maybe I am ready to try out Galore. Another author I've been putting off for far too long is William Gibson. I've heard good things about pattern recognition as well as The Peripheral, so maybe it's about time I revisit Gibson. Now, technically Gibson is American-born, but he is actually a draft-dodging Canadian citizen now. And I figure we can take one back, considering how many Canadians we lose to the United States every year. Neuromancer was a touchstone piece of sci-fi literature. It heralded the idea of cyberpunk and cyberspace. In the ensuing years, it's responsible for things like The Matrix, as well as Lisbeth Salander from The Girl with Dragon Tattoo, although technically it's also responsible for Johnny Mnemonic and The Lawnmower Man, which are both abominations. I'd never been a huge sci-fi nerd, which is odd because I was a huge nerd. I mean, I'd read some Heinlein and Asimov, but I'd always considered that old guy sci-fi. Neuromancer was something completely different. We had hackers, street samurai, AIs, cybernetic enhancements, double crosses. This was a bio-enhanced noir sci-fi thriller that kicks off a continuum of sci-fi that includes Snow Crash, Altered Carbon, and the recently finished Company Town. This is my sci-fi sweet spot. I am super excited for an Altered Carbon TV series, which is coming soon, and maybe eventually we'll get a Neuromancer movie, which has frankly been floating around Hollywood for the past decade or so. Speaking of book-to-movie adaptations, one book that gets a lot of love is The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. It won the Booker as well as the Governor General Award. The ensuing movie would go on to win 9 Academy Awards, as well as picking up the Oscar for Best Picture. But for me, it was mostly I mean, not so that I didn't recently with a bookish podcast where they were discussing whether Michael Ondaatje was in fact Canadian and ultimately settled on English, that I rage quit the episode. I mean, he's not quite that meh, but I just don't get it, especially considering he's responsible for the far superior and to me more influential book, Running in the Family. Running in the Family is a lightly fictionalized memoir of Ondaatje's Sri Lankan family. And the writing here is incredible. Like Michael Crummy, Ondaatje is a sometimes poet and set loose in 1920s Ceylon with its nights of drinking, gambling, dancing, and sometimes gunfights, produces this beautiful and evocative work with words that sing off the page. He's one of those authors, and this is one of those books that make you want to write and then crushes you under the sheer force of its word. And then you come back around again and think, well, maybe I can aspire to those heights. Spoiler, I can't. I mean, I loved this slim volume. I guess The English Patient so destroyed me or disappointed me. I haven't read any Ondaatje since, which is a shame. I should revisit him. But then I get to thinking, how many other authors should I be revisiting or want to revisit? And how can I, considering all the new books that are coming out and the bookish recommendations from BookTube and just, crap. It's a bit of a time capsule for me. It's like looking through an old yearbook, but far less traumatic. Like I said, I'm going to be gone for the next few weeks. So I'm wishing you all a great few weeks of reading. Hopefully there's some good books in store for you all. In the meantime, raise a glass, cheers to Canada, and we'll talk to you soon.